My name is Ayça Günaydın, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this event. We have an interesting topic to explore: gender and populist movement, anti-gender movements, and feminist resistance. Originally, our plan was to feature Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk, the authors of the amazing book Antigender Politics and Populist Movement. Unfortunately, we regret to inform you that Agnieszka Graf is unable to join us due to illness. We extend our warmest wishes for her swift recovery. And dear Elżbieta Korolczuk kindly accepted to proceed with the event. We would like to thank her for accepting to conduct this webinar without her co-author. We are also excited to share the news that a chapter from their book, Counteracting Anti-Gender Movements Toward a Populist Feminism, has been translated into Turkish and will soon be available in our latest edition. I will introduce our speaker in a second, but first some housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. You can type your questions on the box and I will read them all if time permits. As the Journal of Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics, we organize this seminar series with the support of Frederick Ebert Stiftung, and we would like to thank them for their ongoing support in organizing these events. To listen to this talk in Turkish, please select the language you prefer by clicking the globe icon. And I would like to thank our interpreters, Müge Atala and Barış Yıldırım, in advance. In our upcoming edition, we focus on anti-gender politics and feminist struggles. On a global scale, we find ourselves in a period of complex and intersectional crises that include military conflicts, environmental destructions, and challenges to democracy and women's rights. The timing of today's gathering is also important as we are amidst a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, in Karabakh, and in Syria. And despite the escalating violence, we see that countless voices are advocating for peace and call for an end to the violence. And we hope that today's gathering serves as a transnational feminist dialogue and an opportunity to learn from each other's experiences in order to develop feminist strategies to address some of these challenges. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Elżbieta Korolczuk is an associate professor in sociology at Södertörn University in Sweden. She also teaches at Gender Studies Center at Warsaw University. Her research interests involve gender, social movements, civil society, politics of reproduction, and anti-gender movements. She published many texts on the women's movement and its relation with neoliberalism, on new forms of citizenship, politicization of reproduction, and anti-gender mobilization in Poland and abroad. She co-authored with Agnieszka Graf on the anti-gender politics in the populist movement. In her presentation today, she will provide an overview of key concepts from this book. Using examples from Spain, Poland, and Hungary, she will introduce the central themes of anti-gender campaigns and the actors behind them. She will also address some of the recent wave of feminist resistance and discuss its strengths and weaknesses together. Dear Elżbieta, thank you again for accepting our invitation and being with us today. Now it's over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I should say that I am very impressed by the strength and the perseverance of the feminist movement in Turkey, because I know that it's very difficult and very exhausting to continue your work under such difficult conditions. So I just wanted to say that the Polish example shows that there are reasons to have hope, and that hope is something that we do every day in a way. So hope is something that we do today by sharing experience, by talking to each other, by trying to find interpretations of what is happening. I would like to share my screen because I have a presentation to share with you. And I should probably say at the beginning that the work that I'm presenting has been published together with Agnieszka in the book Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Movement. It's open access, so if you would like, you can download it. It's in English. And but actually the work on different forms of opposition to feminism and right-wing populism has been continuing, in my case, for the last at least 10 years. The first moment where we noticed the emergence of a new wave of opposition to gender equality, to minority rights, was around 2012. And that was the moment when the issue of gender, the concept of gender, has emerged as resignified by the right. And in Poland, as in many other countries that are not English-speaking countries, the very term gender has been to some extent foreign, and it has been transplanted through gender studies, through gender mainstreaming, through gender theory or critical theory on gender. But that was the moment around 2010, 2012, when right-wing groups, religious fundamentalists, started to use the term gender in a new way, sort of hijacking its meaning. And that's why we talk about anti-gender politics or anti-gender movement, even though in many contexts it sounds strange or even ridiculous, because how can you be against gender, which is about, construction of being female or male, or sort of constructing these differences as a binary or as a continuum. So today I would like you to come with me in a journey. I would like to invite you for a journey, and I would like to start with 3 short vignettes, examples from Poland, Spain, and Hungary, because my work and Agnieszka's work is mostly focused on Europe, and right now I am involved more in studying Sweden, the country where I worked for quite a long time, but where the anti-gender campaign take very different forms. So it is very context specific, but at the same time, there are elements that connect those different campaigns, those different actors, those different networks. I would like to present you key ideas from our book. I will be talking about opportunistic synergy, anti-colonial frame, about intellectual roots of anti-genderism, so where it's come from, and also anti-gender, and also I'll try to present my interpretation or our interpretation as to why does it work in so many contexts. And this connects to the view of anti-gender campaigns as a conservative response to neoliberalism. And then I would like to move towards feminist responses and present you the concept of feminist or populist feminism. And I hope that this will be also a way to move us towards a conversation, because I'm also very interested in how you see that in the Turkish context, both when it comes to anti-gender campaigns and the feminist responses. So when it comes to Poland, we had at least 3 waves of anti-gender campaigns. A lot of them, a lot of those struggles were about abortion. And in Poland, abortion has been banned since 1993. And in 2020, the Constitutional Tribunal have removed one of the 3 exceptions which functioned in the Polish context, because since 1993, abortion has been, allowed in hospitals if the mother's health or life was in danger, if there was a malformation in the fetus, or if the pregnancy was the outcome of rape. And the 2020 Constitutional Tribunal ruling has removed one of those 3 exceptions, which is the malformation of the fetus, which was one of the biggest exceptions in terms of how many women gain access to abortion services. And that was one of those huge battles in which we found ourselves in a situation where the experiences and rights of women in Poland when it comes to reproductive rights have been severely restricted during the last 8 years. But another huge issue is the question of LGBTQ people. And one of those elements of those homophobic and transphobic tendencies is the initiative for especially local municipalities, small cities, towns, to declare themselves to be free from gender ideology. So these declarations didn't really have any specific legal standing, but the idea was to stop LGBTQ rights organizations to come to schools, for example, or to make it more difficult to organize pride marches, or to restrict financial support for such organizations. In 2019, almost 1/3 of Poland has become sort of LGBT-free zones, because those local municipalities have either declared themselves to be free from so-called LGBT ideology, or they signed so-called the local government charter of the rights of the family. As we well know, a lot of conservative forces, a lot of religious fundamentalists claim that they want to protect the family, protect the children from the dangers of feminism, gender ideology, or LGBTQ ideology. And that was actually a campaign which coincided with political campaigns, electoral campaigns in Poland. So that was the moment where homophobia became truly a political tool for these struggles. An interesting issue is that actually now in 2023, most of those municipalities has backtracked their declarations, mostly due to actions coming from LGBTQ movement, from the feminist movement. There were court cases which those municipalities lost, but also an important tool again to fight against this kind of initiatives was to inform the European Union about this kind of initiatives, because that meant that those local municipalities could not get European Union money for their activities. And that financial incentive turned out to be very important in the process of stopping these initiatives. Another example is from Spain, and in the Spanish context, you can see very clearly this cooperation between political party, ultra-conservative, right-wing, extreme right-wing party Vox, and an organization which is a civil society organization, Hasta Oír, and they joined forces, as it is happening in many contexts. So this coalition between ultra-conservative civil society groups and political parties, and often churches are in between or engaged in these campaigns. And one of their campaigns in 2019 was this campaign. You can see one of the elements of this campaign was Stop Feminazis, with the portrait, with the representation of Hitler with this kind of pink lipstick, with suggestion that actually the feminists are the modern Nazis. And the main goal of this campaign was to stop financing or stop legislation concerning gender-based violence. And the claim was that there is no gender-based violence. It's just the violencia domestica, which is the violence in the space of a private home. And as you can see, an important element of this campaign, and that is the upper left-right corner image, is the vision of Vox as this valiant king or knight who supposedly fights against those numerous threats, including LGBT, of course, including socialism or maybe communism, including feminism. So there is this vision of anti-gender campaigners as those who fight against the elites, those who are protecting local communities against those who have power. And I will come back to this later because it is quite an important element of this narrative. And the final element is the Hungarian 22 referendum to stop what Urban called gender insanity in the name of common sense. And in Hungary is a quite interesting context when it comes to anti-gender campaigns, because there the religious element is lacking, and still the movement element, in fact, and still the government, the Urban's government, has the key role in promoting anti-gender campaigns, anti-gender discourses. And of course, here again, the question of family and so-called sexualization of children through sex education was one of the key elements. So the idea was that this is the last moment to protect children from the alleged sexualization through, for example, knowledge about the existence of LGBTQ people. And the idea that this sexualization is, of course, connected to pedophilia because it sort of is a way to groom children, to make them more susceptible to becoming victims of pedophilic acts. That referendum was also not very successful because it didn't reach the threshold to make it valid. But it is quite important to understand that behind those campaigns are not only specific parties, religious institutions, or non-governmental organizations, but also states as themselves, in themselves, as in the case of Hungary. So when we look at these anti-gender campaigns, it is quite clear that today it is a very coherent movement which has religious roots, and those roots are, of course, the roots in the Vatican's opposition to gender as a concept or gender equality as a value, entering especially international treaties and entering the sphere of international politics in the 90s. But at the same time, when we look at it today, it is quite clear that it is a political movement. When we look at, which has many roots, many different organizations engaged, but at the same time, which has a certain level of coordination, cooperation, and it's quite consistent in the ways in which it presents both the threats and the solutions to those threats. So when we look, you can see logos of different organizations, such as the World Congress of Families, which originated in the 90s in the United States and today is connected with International Organization for Family in the United States, but it had from the beginning also some Russian intellectuals or activists engaged. And until recently, until the war in Ukraine, which broke in last year, you could see that there is a lot of cooperation with Central Eastern Europe, and also World Congress of Families made important inroads into the African continent. They have their own chapter of World Congress of Families in Nairobi, and it's quite clear that they have global ambitions. There are also organizations or networks such as Agenda Europe, which is kind of understated network of different elite actors, both civil society organizations, but also politicians or ex-politicians who coordinate their actions across the globe in a fashion that is not very visible to the public, but which has certain consequences for the public in terms of how they plan their works. And also La Manif pour Tout, the French grassroots movement, it also shows that in some countries there is at least an attempt to create a grassroots movement around issues of sort of protection of family and children. In the French context, this movement emerged as a response to the legal changes concerning the equality for LGBTQ families. But of course, it is exported to other countries, such as Germany and Italy. So there's a lot of international and transnational connections and mobilization. But what has really made this, because when we think about, opposition to feminism or opposition to gay rights, opposition to reproductive rights, these are not new elements, these are not new trends, obviously. But what has made this new wave of this opposition visible and quite powerful is the opportunistic synergy between the civil society actors, religious institutions, and right-wing populist parties. And that we can see in many different contexts. Poland is one of them. If you think about the coalition that was in power during the last 8 years, this coalition has enabled anti-gender activists to enter powerful positions, to have influence over politics, to have influence over the discourses which are spread by the president, the prime minister, the key politicians, and also gave them access to money and power, as it is usually the case. Here you have the pictures from the World Congress of Feminists in 2019 in Verona. I was there. I took part in the Congress, and it was very interesting to see this synergy between people such as Brian Brown. This is the gentleman with the red tie on the picture, who is the leader of the World Congress of Feminists and International Organization for Family, and the key politician at that time in Italy. And of course, now with Giorgia Meloni, I would say that anti-gender movement has even more power or connection to leading politicians than at the times of Salvini, although Salvini was also basically greeted during the World Congress of Feminists in Verona as a savior, as a leader of the movement as well. There was like huge clapping around when he came to the podium, and he sort of really felt at home during the World Congress of Feminists. So in a sense, you can see this opportunistic synergy works for both groups, because on the one hand, for anti-gender movement, it is an opportunity to gain influence, power, and financial support. But for the right-wing populists, it also a chance to actually strengthen this polarization between the elite and the people by vilifying minority groups, such as feminists, such as LGBTQ people, as part of the elite, and to moralize this division. So thicken this sort of thin ideology of populism. And at the same time, when we look at the roots of anti-genderism, because I believe, and we both believe with Agnieszka, that this is an ideological project, we can see this Catholic anti-modernism or anti-liberalism, which has been present within Catholicism or Christianity more broadly for a long term. And I'm focusing on Christianity because I think that in the European context, that works very closely with this white nationalism that is present in many countries. So Catholicism is present there also as a sort of source of Islamophobia. Then you have another root of the anti-gender campaigns, which is US culture wars. When we think about the narratives about, children being endangered by gays, because gays cannot reproduce, so they have to recruit. This is the language that has been invented in late 70s and 80s in the United States, often by women such as Anita Bryant or other ultra-conservative leaders. And that has been transplanted into many other contexts, almost one-to-one. At the same time, you can see very clear elements of conspiratorial thinking, and especially when you look at the online spaces where anti-gender groups are present, they very often seamlessly connect with different conspiratorial groups. We could see it, for example, in the case of COVID pandemic. So it was very interesting for me to see how the gender groups have included also, for example, anti-vaxxers. And one of the elements of this narrative which legitimized this connection was that vaccines are produced with the use of fetus tissue. So you can see how different groups like anti-gender and alt-right sort of and anti-vax have quite often a lot of connections. And sometimes these are the same people, but sometimes they are not. And also you could see the anti-Semitic imaginary, which is present there. And I think that the focus on Soros, the Hungarian Jew, is very, it has its reasons. It's not just that he is a powerful person and he sponsors, I don't know, open democracy and CEU, but it's also about this idea that there is a elite group of people hiding in the shadows who finance this moral decline of civilization, Western civilization. And then, of course, the question is, how does it work, right?
Şu soru karşımıza çıkıyor.
What makes this narratives about the decline of civilization, about the danger to traditional values, about the danger to families, about danger to children? What makes it work in terms of this ideological cohesion? A lot of that has to do with emotions, but also a lot of this power, emotional power, comes from taking over narratives and concepts used by progressive groups, feminist groups, human rights discourse, basically. So it was for us really interesting to see how anti-genderists, which are usually white male conservatives from United States, for example, of all places, how they used the idea of ideological colonization or neocolonialism as a point of reference to vilify progressive movements, to vilify feminism, to vilify international institutions such as United Nations or World Health Organizations and so on. So they create this anti-colonial frame, and I've shown you this vision of the Vox Party in Spain as this valiant knight fighting with all those great forces, powerful elite forces. This imagery really taps into the ways in which we imagine the world today. And it really allows the people who support those groups to feel that their anxieties, that their fear are not only valid or legitimate, but also that they are the force of the good, right? And part of this narrative is to shame those alleged elites and to install pride into people who support anti-gender conservative movements. And especially in the European context, it has to do with this kind of image of a new moral geography of Europe. And you can see it very clearly in Central Eastern European countries, post-communist countries, that they're being singled out as the source of moral rejuvenation of the corrupt West. So in Poland, for example, we have all those people coming from Germany, such as Gabrielle Kubi, for example. She's an intellectual sociologist writing books about how gender is a dangerous force in modern world. And they're coming to Poland and telling conservative groups, yes, you will be the savior of the West. And that strengthens this anti-EU, anti-globalization sentiment, which is often rooted in real anxieties or real deficiencies of the ways in which transnational institutions and bodies function. So there's always this element of tapping into existing issues, but then presenting the solutions, which doesn't really answer the problems that are at the root. And that also connects with interpreting those movements as a reactionary response to neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism is something that is pervasive in our world. When we think about precarization of working and life and living conditions, when we think about commodification of our lives, of the commodification of reproductive work and social reproduction more broadly, we can see that there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems that neoliberalism generates. And anti-gender movement tries to tap into those anxieties and address those problems, claiming that we have to come back to traditional family because it can be a refuge from commodification, from alienation, from precarity. So they position themselves, the anti-gender movement position itself as a champion of people, their people, against individualism, against globalization, against economization. So it is not a coincidence that parents are often the target groups of those organizations and networks, because they are invoked in their parental role to act upon those threats and those issues. So when we think about feminist opposition, just as anti-gender movements take different forms in different contexts, also feminist opposition is at the same time very context-specific and united. And I must say that I've been a feminist activist for around 20 years now, and I often worked with or in small, informal, autonomous groups. And I always wished for the women's movement to become mass movement. And that actually happened in 2016. And that was a huge mass response towards the attempts of the then ruling coalition to introduce further restrictions in abortion law. But also it was, I would say, an opposition towards the more broader trend of going farther away from values such as equality, tolerance, plurality. And I remember myself, because I was there, so these are the pictures that I took during this demonstration. There was like a huge tower that we climbed with my friends. And I remember thinking that I always wished for this to happen, but I never actually envisioned it to really, happening. And that was quite an emotional moment. And what was really remarkable about that was also that not only women, because this is Warsaw, the capital of Poland, right? So the women's movement, or more broadly, progressive movements, have always been more strong there. But that you could see in many other places. And these are pictures from this Black Monday, so-called Black Monday in 2016, where you have over 300 different places all over Poland, sometimes small villages, small towns. Sometimes there was one place where there was just one woman who went to the public square in her hometown. And this sense of change, this sense of feminism becoming a mass movement, a movement of ordinary women, not an elite endeavor, was very strong. And of course, it took us another almost 6 years to actually influence the political change that we have witnessed during the last elections. But it always, as usual with social movements, it starts with sort of redefining who are we. And this process was quite a long one, and I will tell you sort of a long story short, but we have witnessed like 2 waves of feminist manifestations, but also mobilization. 2016, 2017 was the first wave of mass movement, but in 2020, when the Constitutional Tribunal has made public its decision, unlawful decision, by the way, because the Constitutional Tribunal judges have been illegally appointed. when they made the decision public that this one of the three exceptions will be removed from the law, claimed that it's unconstitutional, that was the moment where you could see like the second wave of mobilization, which very much consisted of young people. I mean, teenagers, 20-year-olds. You could see this picture in the middle, which was the biggest manifestation, one of the biggest manifestations in the history of Poland. 400,000, as I said, mostly young people in the center of Warsaw. During the pandemic, by the way, which made it illegal gathering. That marked a generational change in Poland as well, because and it is very much connected with the question of religion and the critique of Catholic Church. That was the very first moment where this mass women's movement or feminist movement started to openly critique the Catholic Church as the source of inequality in Poland. Also, the LGBTQ issues have become one of those salient elements of mobilization for the young people, because that was the moment I told you before about these LGBTQ free zones. That was the moment of a peak of political homophobia and transphobia in Poland. And the young people have really responded to these trends with mass mobilization and also mass change in terms of opinions, values, and views. And Poland, as it turned out, is the fastest secularizing country in the world, in a sense that the gap between the younger generation and the older generation is the biggest. And that was also the moment where you could see a huge shift in public opinion. 70% of Poles declared their support for those protests, and 14% have declared that they participated in those protests in one way or another. And you could see this shift in public opinion both towards the Catholic Church and also the question of abortion, because you could see how the steady growth of acceptance of abortion rights, despite this huge mobilization against reproductive rights in Poland. So you could see how the political elite of conservative government, supported by the religious fundamentalists from the Catholic Church, and the majority of Poles, and especially young people, have become positioned on the collision course. And that has been one of the key issues, I would say, that led to a huge mobilization of young people during the last elections. Comparing to the elections before, there was a 20% increase of voters. So basically, you could see that more than 70% of young people voted in the last elections, which is not usual for Poland. And you could see how this young generation has created a new idea of how the world should function, how they became emboldened by the mass character of those mobilizations, and how those protests have gained in sort of political content. So to wrap up my today's intervention, I think that when we think about democracy, whether it is functioning or not very well functioning, as it happens in many countries right now, one of the key issues is the question of who are the people, the question of how to define the people. Because right-wing populists usually create this division, this polarization between the elites and the people. And of course, they position themselves as the representatives of the people, who are gender conservative, in the Polish case, Catholic, in most cases, nationalist. And then they try to create this vision of elites, cosmopolitan, decadent, immoral. To that vision, women's movement, feminist movement has presented a very different definition of the people, saying, and this is what we call populist feminism, saying, we are the people, not you, corrupt, brutal political elites, but we, the women, the LGBTQ people, the minorities, and we construct this us based on pluralism, intersectionality, and solidarity. So this populist feminism is both new identity of us, infused with emotions such as solidarity, such as empathy, such as hope, which is enabled by the logic of connective action, which comes with the use of the internet, of course, because that has become a huge mobilizing tool for the young people. So this logic of connective action means that we don't have to have this coherent identity of feminist activist before we move to the streets. We move to the streets because the information that we have and share, often online, becomes part of what we see as our identity. We can see that this mass women's movement have new type of activities, new leaders have emerged, new strategies, but also to make it stronger, what is happening to some extent and what is needed is the cooperation, the coordination between the new and the old sections of the movement, because the broad coalitions are the ones that enable us to be politically efficient. And I really do hope that looking at this mobilizations, looking at this, the energy that so many people put into activism, that we can be hopeful, that we have to see the opportunities that there are and not only what we are struggling against. Thank you so much.
Dear Elżbieta, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And your presentation tonight, and as well as your book, provides us such an important understanding how gender has become a central topic. Why you clearly show us the complex relationships between anti-gender mobilizations and the right-wing populism. And it's also so important that your perspective that emphasize anti-genderism as not another version of a backlash, not only, or a kind of religious attack that undermine gender equalities, but rather a combination of religious, political, and cultural elements here is so important. And thank you again for tonight for providing some clear pictures of feminist responses in certain occasions. I believe there will be a lot to discuss tonight. And I will now open the floor for questions. Please, everyone, type your questions on the Q&A box, and I will read them out for our speaker to answer. To kick things off, I want to ask a question while waiting others to write their questions. You conceptualize anti-gender mobilization as an ideological project, and you emphasize its transnational connections, the actors involved. You also make references to anti-genderism in academia as a kind of their attempt to legitimize themselves as an alternative knowledge production, as an area of expertise. May I kindly ask you to provide some details on how anti-genderism operates within the academic context, especially in Poland? What are their strategies, or to what extent are they effective in the academic context? Thank you.
Yes, I think that knowledge production and expertise is an important element of those campaigns. One that I didn't touch upon because it's just too broad a topic, but very important nonetheless. I think that there are at least three elements to that. One consists of attacks on gender studies, critical race studies, basically any type of critical studies or critical approach as too political, unscientific, ideological. So basically the idea is that those areas of studies should not be seen as legitimate science. And this process of delegitimization looks different in different contexts. But what is important to see that it often happens in context. I observe it now in Sweden, where gender studies are being attacked as too ideological, too political, and there are commentators, conservative commentators, who claim that they are like a religion, right? So this is the narrative which delegitimizes gender studies in the Swedish context, for example. But elements of that are very visible in different contexts. In the United States, for example, it's mostly about critical race studies, but gender studies or feminist studies are also under attack. So this tactic of delegitimization of gender studies is one of them. And in the Polish context, it's kind of straightforward, right? Saying feminists are communists and we had communism, so we should not have any gender studies. And another version of this story is gender studies are foreign, are from United States, so we should also not have gender studies because they're foreign to the Polish culture. So pick and choose, whichever you want. So delegitimization is one element. Another is constructing counter knowledge, which often seamlessly blends with gender studies. So, for example, producing books which criticize gender studies as unscientific, blah, 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 or proposing some kind of religious interpretation of gender, but using strategically this term gender and, sort of this ends up with both studies in gender studies and anti-gender books end up on the same shelf in the bookstore. So that's the idea. Science is about boundary making. And they want to change those boundaries or dismantle them. And I would say it's very effective. And it's a common strategy, which we can see also in case of studies and research on, for example, climate change, that you would have a steady increase of works which claim that climate change is not happening, and they end up in the same sort of space where you have books which actually document actual research on climate change. So this is happening all the time. So this is the second strategy. And the third strategy concerns academic institutions and the ways in which those institutions functions. In Poland, for example, we have introduced a system which affects your professional advancement in academia. Basically, it's a system system of evaluation, which deems whether you will have, habilitation or doctoral degree or whatever. A system of points that you get for publications. So if you publish in American journal with high impact factor, you will get 200 points, right? But if you publish in some journal with a much smaller impact factor, we'll have 70 points. And then the point system is being constructed by the ministry. So what the ministry did was to include, for example, publishers, very small publishers, for example, backed by the Catholic Church, and give them, 100 points for the publication. So very clearly, if these people who publish there will get a lot of points, they will end up in higher position in academia. And that's the whole goal, the exchange of elites in academic world. So these are the different strategies, and there are more, of course, but I think it's very important to see them for what they are. And they are ways to delegitimize not only gender studies, but more broadly critical approach to society and political engagement in academia.
And thank you for giving examples, especially from the strategies that you use. I'm not quite sure about the institutions in Turkey, the academic institutions, but I see that we can see that some of the books circulating anti-gender discourses are now started translated into Turkish and now displayed on the bookshelves in Turkey as well. Maybe my friends can give more examples from Turkey. And I see another question from the chat. Zeynep is asking about how would you describe the current state of the populist feminist movement you mentioned? Could this populist feminism contribute to the institutionalization of women's movement? Did it strengthen the feminist movement's organizational capacity? It's mostly about this question about the institutionalization of this new populist feminism that you mentioned, that you conceptualized. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that there is internal tension within populist feminism and the process of institutionalization or political institutions. Because the populist element there is also this element which says we are the people, so we are working against existing elites. So it can really impair the process of institutionalization, and especially the move from the movement, for example, towards politics. And we can see it in Poland. But it's really interesting for me to see that the Polish women's strike has institutionalized into an organization. It's a foundation, I think. And it is, I would say, still powerful, but not as powerful as we could expect, given the huge number of people, women on the street and so on. At the same time, we can see quite a lot of female politicians coming from this movement and entering political arena. I think now in these elections, we have probably around 10 MPs who had connections with the women's movement and who have entered the parliament. And also we can see it on the local level. So they have support of the movement, but I would say they have to stand there on their own feet, in a sense, to enter the political arena. And then they have to claim sort of a slightly different identity, right? Because this populist identity of we the people has certain problems with representation, and also have problem with existing institutions. So this tension is always there. This tension is very visible. But I would say that for now it plays in a quite interesting and fruitful way in the Polish context. But I can see also how in some contexts it can be impeding the sort of development of the movement or impeding its political impact.
Yep, I see. Thank you. I see a question in the chat box, might be a follow-up to this. It's about the question from Turgay Bayındır, and the question is about your concept, the term using populist feminism. I'm reading the question now. In Turkish, the word populist has a negative connotation, meaning manipulation of the masses by appealing to their sensibilities. Firstly, do you also get this negative meaning from populist? Secondly, are you suggesting that the way to fight the right wing is to adopt their weapons? This kind of question related to the populist feminism.
Yes, I should probably mention that the way I define populism is very in line with Chantal Mouffe's proposition, who says that populism is basically a reaction to democratic deficit. So usually, because if you look at different moments of history and different contexts, you can basically see two types of populism, right? The right wing and the left wing. And in the European context, I think that the populism as a term has very bad name, and in the Polish context as well. So we are sort of going against the current proposing this term of populist feminism. What I'm referring to here is that, because I believe Chantal Mouffe that, and I also agree with other scholars who show that, that populism usually is rooted in the problem with representation and the problem of voice. A bit like Margaret Canavan also said that, there's in democracy, there's always this question of voice, right? And the question of representation. And usually you have the populist movements or populist politicians gaining in significance or in power where there is this deficit, right? Where there is a group of people who feels unheard. So in that sense, I think that we have to see those movements as expression of a real problem. Without seeing this problem, we cannot really answer to the problem of populism. A right-wing populism, I would say it is a problem. But at the same time, what I think the populists get right, they get a lot of things wrong, especially the right-wing populists, because they really are anti-pluralist, very hierarchical, and they make promise that they never want to fulfill, which is give voice to the people. They never do that, actually. But when we think about what they do right, is understanding that politics, in its broad sense, is also about emotions. I think that one of the main problems with the left-wing politics or progressive politics in the last 2 decades is sort of forgetting about emotions. and claiming that, we can explain people, we can teach people, we can educate people into what we want them to believe or see. I think that we are emotional beings, and politics is about emotions. So it's not just about thinking, oh, there is the reason and there is emotions. I think that we have to have both. And I think that this is something that we can pick up from populists to understand how to use emotions in a productive way. Because I don't think I have become feminist because I got educated into, believing that it's important. Of course, I got educated, but my first instinct was emotional. I wanted to be part of a movement that works towards solidarity, that works towards a form of hope in the future. And I think that we have to understand it about politics. If we think about politics as just a play of facts and reason, we are losing it.
Thank you. I see many questions in the chat box. I hope we can have time to cover all of them. I will now take another question. Do you see a correlation between anti-gender movements and gender-based violence? In Turkish case, we see skyrocketing numbers in femicide cases, which more often than not accompanied by provocation defense in aiming to put the blame on the victim of transgressing the traditional norms and legitimizing the criminal act.
Yes, I think that I would even say on a broader scale, when I look at what's happening now, the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, which is also a war, I think that this is sort of an obvious next step. Once you made this step from believing that violence is not acceptable into believing that violence is a necessary form of defense against the other, which is vilified as powerful, as cunning, as immoral, as dangerous, then bloodshed becomes the next step. Then violence, physical violence, fascism basically, becomes the next step. So it's not a coincidence, I would say, that the violence rises, both domestic violence, gender-based violence, and also war, happens at the peak of those tendencies, because this is exactly what the anti-gender narrative does in its extreme forms, is legitimizing violence as acceptable, as necessary, as something that we have to do because we are endangered. And I think this is always this necessary step towards violence, that you have to believe that you are right when you use violence, and you have to believe that the victim inflicted the violence upon itself or upon herself or himself. Once this victim-perpetrator reversal is done, it's so much easier to retract the violence. So I think that this is very much connected.
I agree with you. Thank you. And another question about the women's movement. This is in Turkish. I will read it out, and I hope you will hear it in English.
Thank you very much for your speech concerning the increase of femicides and violence against women and the rights restrictions. Many women around the world are revolting. In Argentina and Latin America, Ni Una Menos, and activities in Europe, anti-Trump marches, anti-abortion marches in Poland, and Me Too movement, etc. Especially after 2010 and 2015, we see that there is an increase in it. They also say that it's the fourth wave of feminism. So you are referring to post-2015 women's movements and the impact on the society. How do you evaluate these, particularly post-2015 movements?
Yeah, so basically when I was talking about Poland, and also when I was giving these examples from other countries, showing the pictures from United States, but also other contexts, Argentina included, I was referring to this type of new wave of feminist mobilization. And it's quite interesting for me that these mass mobilization often start with questions of bodily autonomy, whether it is violence or reproductive rights, but usually they become much broader and turn into a demand for a better world, the world which is not as hierarchical, not as full of violence, not as patriarchal as it is now. So I think that there is a very strong connection of those two tendencies. On the one hand, this attempt to stop progressive changes, because I think that when we look at the changes in the people's worldviews and opinions and so on, in most countries, not all of course, but in most countries you can see, especially with the young people, sort of orientation towards more progressive or leftist values. And then you have the right-wing populists and religious fundamentalists and extremists who really try to stop those changes and sort of reverse the clock. And then you have a mass women's movement post-2015 who try to push against this patriarchal time. And I think that one of the main problems that we see globally is that in many countries, and I'm thinking about democratic countries only, right, which should be less problematic in a sense, you see this juncture between the political sphere, which is led by basically white old males who are creating the politics for the past, and the needs and desires of especially younger generation and minority groups, including who try to push for the politics for the future, right? And this is, I think, that this huge conflict that we have now, that we have, as I said, even in democratic countries, you have politicians who are designing the world for their generation, for the past, and not thinking about the future. And I'm thinking that on the long run, this has to, as in the case of Poland, there has to be this clash between those two tendencies. And I do hope that this clash will be a generational clash, and that we will have a change for the better in the future.
Thank you. I think now this question is a little bit about the impact of this clash in the recent elections in Poland. The question is, I'm reading it again. I would appreciate if you could reflect on the discourses on gender and anti-gender in election campaigns on both sides. We understand that the former ruling party used anti-gender rhetoric in their attempt to consolidate their electoral base. However, obviously this rhetoric and their elements of their campaign was not sufficient to win the elections. Do you think the use of anti-genderism had an effect on election results? What was the opposition strategy against this rhetoric? Was it ignoring, not speaking about it at all, or did they use counter-arguments?
I think that these elections were really interesting because the ruling right-wing coalition didn't really use much of the anti-gender rhetoric anymore. I would say they even wanted to hide it to some extent, because they were afraid, because you could see in the opinion polls that a lot of people, even in their own constituency, are not big fans of, for example, further restrictions in the abortion rights. So that was really interesting because in the Polish context, we also had referendum, which also didn't reach the threshold. But in contrast to the urban referendum, none of the three questions were about anything concerning gender. So I can see that I could see that they really tried to retract their extreme positions to some extent, as I said. So it was, if we compare these elections with, for example, last elections or the presidential elections, which were like truly homophobic, I would say, these elections were really they really tried to scale down because they were fighting for the people who, not for their core supporters who are gender conservative, but they were fighting for people who were undecided. And what the opposition has done was to actually bring attention to those issues. It was very interesting, for example, to see we had at least 10 big campaigns oriented towards mobilizing people to vote, especially young people and women. And all of those campaigns were constructed in a way as to show that the ruling coalition wants to encroach upon your bodily rights, your privacy, your right to choose, and you have to make them accountable. So there were a lot of those videos online showing, for example, I don't know, young couple wanting to have sex, for example, And then all of a sudden, there is a bishop or a politician appearing, from under the bedside saying, no, you cannot use contraception because this is against God's will. And the couple would say, like, why? But what are you doing in our house? And the guy will say, you elected me because you didn't go to elections. So a lot of those campaigns were mobilizing, especially young people and women, based on the premise that this is the moment where you have to decide, and you can decide who will have an impact upon your private life. So it was sort of like changing positions. The right tried to hide their extreme positions, and the opposition tried to show what they have done to make people more mobilized.
Thank you. I do have some internet issues from my end. I hope you can hear me right now. Here another question I will address. It's mostly about the problems or the issues inside gender studies or within the discipline itself maybe. It's again in Turkish. I am reading it out. Akademide bazı gender çalışmaları toplumu anlamaya müthiş katkı sunarken
Some of the gender studies in the academy are contributing a lot to understand the society, but sometimes it's really understand, explain, and even make a sense out of some gender studies. If you criticize them, you can be easily called an anti-gender, but all criticism is not anti-gender criticism. It's very important whether or not the academic papers produced are scientific and what are they promising scientifically. Is there a critical discussion in academy and how these criticisms affecting how the anti-gender movements are affecting these critical discussions?
Yeah, it's I guess it's how to sort of distill a lot of thoughts that I have around this topic into coherent sentences. I think that there are many different views on, for example, what is gender within gender studies and feminism. And for a quite long time, depending on the country, we had those different conceptions and concepts and intellectual traditions coexisting, sometimes clashing, sometimes just maybe ignoring each other. I'm thinking, for example, about, I don't know, the Italian context where you have quite strong feminism of difference, which is very focused on the idea of men and women being sort of biologically rooted identities. And then, of course, you have sort of gender concept of sex differences as being constructed culturally and socially. And then you have, of course, tradition, like in UK, for example, you have a strong tradition of radical feminism and so on. And what I observe now is that because the context has changed and some anti-gender actors take up some elements of gender or feminist theories, or at least the language, and sometimes they create coalitions to which they, for example, invite, let's say, gender critical feminists. These issues become much more accelerated as conflictual because the stake is no longer, what kind of theory we will have, but rather what kind of politics we will have. So I would say that the changing context, on the one hand, does not really allow for this kind of open, critical, open atmosphere for a free discussion within gender studies, because I think a lot of people feel threatened. So that sort of contributes to less possibilities for exchange and also critical encounters. And at the same time, I also observe very strongly that the conflicts within gender studies and feminism more broadly, also in terms of activism, accelerated because of the changes in the context. It is in a sense like, we are in this broad field in which we have different players and people stayed within their positions since the 70s, but the whole platform has changed. So they are no longer in the position that they were 10, 20 years ago. So I think that we have a lot of problems, which I think we address within gender studies, for better or worse. But I think that one of the elements of this trend which worries me the most is the fact that this acceleration of conflict and infighting makes it very difficult to have an informed discussion about, for example, how do we imagine the future of gender studies, or what do we think about the discipline, and what could be its main contribution to both science and society.
Thank you. I think we have 3 more questions that I haven't addressed yet. The 2 of them are a bit related, and I will try to ask together. It's mostly about the discussions around family, the discourses that's turning around family within these issues of anti-genderism. Is there a way to fight the usage of family as a women's oppression method by the right wing? Has there been examples of it from the populist feminism? And the other question also is in Turkish, but it's mostly asking about, do families see gender studies or LGBT population as a kind of threat to the reproduction of the families, the generation of families?
Yeah, I think that one way of sort of fighting back is to reclaim the family, because I think that's what the LGBTQ movement is doing exactly, right? In many contexts, I'm thinking about United States, but also Poland as well. One of the narratives which serve the goal of achieving marriage equality is saying that everyone has the right to create a family, right? That those families can be different, and they usually are. So I think that one of the ways is to actually fight for the concept, fight for the family, because I think that the real conflict is not so much about whether we think family is important or not, because for all of us, family is important, but rather what is the definition of family, right? And how this definition is being restricted by the conservative right to include only mother, father, and child, right, or children. While in reality, family, both geographically and also historically, was very often something else than mother, father, and family, and children. So I think that's one way to fight it. Another is to fight for motherhood, and I think that I've been in my activism and also in my research, I've been focusing for quite a long time on motherhood and on especially the rights of single mothers. And I often felt that I have to fight for this topic also within feminism, because it doesn't seem to be interesting, especially for younger generation, right? Family is rather opposed to, because it is patriarchal and, constrict our rights and so on and so forth. I think that we really have to make sure that we are fighting both for the right of women or anyone to not have children, and at the same time fight for the rights of women and everyone to have children in a good conditions, being supported by the society, being supported by the state. So I think we have to fight for both the family and motherhood and parenthood, because I think that these elements are key to our societies, but also key to feminism.
Thank you. Sorry,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very important, as you said. Yeah, what is the promoted family that is promised to be strengthened by these governments and supported, and what is actually happening? What are the real families? Who are they? The meaning, the diversification of those meanings are so important. It's also important for Turkish case, because the government for so long has been trying to promote the strengthened family. But what actually is the family in the real time is the real question, I guess. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that one.
Yeah, and it's quite amazing because, if you think about like American anti-gender activists coming to Nairobi, for example, telling them that feminism is, colonizing the continent and sort of attacking the traditional family. And the local activists and also gender scholars telling them but that's not the type of family that we had for, traditionally. So the tradition is very different here. Like, hello, have you noticed that? And it's like full of contradictions. This process of clashing of, different definitions and different norms and different ideas is very complex. But I think that we have to also stick to our experience, our lives, you know. And I think that it also makes for a powerful argument in these debates.
Thank you. I think there's one more question left that I haven't mentioned. And this might be a kind of an opportunity for us to wrap up the webinar, because you have mentioned this in your presentation, but it's a good opportunity to remind it, to discuss it a bit more. It's again in Turkish, I'm reading it out. Toplumsal cinsiyet karşıtı hareketlerin bazı ülkelerde tabandan gelmesini, Doğu Avrupa'daki bazı ülkelerde böyle geliştiğini okuyoruz. Bazı ülkelerde tavandan, yani iktidarlar, hükümetler tarafından büyütülmeye, oluşturulmaya çalışılması üzerine neler söylemek istersiniz? Sunumunuz için çok teşekkürler.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the translation, unfortunately.
Can you hear it right now?
No.
Okay, the question is about, you mentioned about that the anti-gender mobilization sometimes coming from the bottom of some organizations, some groups, different levels of the public, but also in some countries it's from the top-down policies, from the governments. You gave some examples on this. The question is again asking about these top-down policies coming from governments, of examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, we can see it in many different contexts. In Poland, for example, the type of political homophobia that we get was very strong in sort of promoting local governments, for example, to actually have those initiatives. And even though those initiatives at the municipality levels to, for example, declare these LGBT-free zones were taken by the local communities, they were often coordinated by national organization, right? So it's very tricky to actually distinguish what is top down and what is bottom up. But I think especially in countries such as Hungary, and I would say, but correct me if I'm wrong, Turkey as well, these decisions are very often coming from the government, from the political elite, even though they are disguised as something that the people demand. And this concerns educational system, for example, higher education, issues connected to welfare policies, for example, and so on and so forth. So you can see how this is very much interconnected. On the one hand, you have transnational actors who are active in many different countries, and they have connections with political elites. Then you have the political elites themselves who are adopting some elements of those anti-gender discourses. And then you have local actors who sometimes strategically appear as local, but often are in many ways connected with those transnational and national ones.
I think it's also the case in Turkey. It's hard to define the distinctions, but we can easily say that for so long, the government policy is supporting, strengthening families, restricting women's role as within domestic spaces as mothers, and not providing enough care facilities, not providing enough economical independence for women. These are all step-by-step some policies that is helping these anti-gender discourses in a way. Thank you very much. I hope you're not so tired. I think we have addressed all the questions in the chat box. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. It was an amazing presentation, and thank you again for your insightful responses to the questions. And many thanks again to our simultaneous interpreters, Müge Atal and Barış Yıldırım. They were with us on this seminar series. And I would also like to thank Pınar Ecevitoğlu from the Frederick Ebert Fund. She helped us a lot to make these events real. And in a couple of weeks, we are expecting to release our final latest edition, and there will be articles that discussing these issues, including your article with dear Agnieszka Graf from this book. And please, everyone, follow us on our social media accounts, stay informed about the information about the release of this final edition. Yep, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope we covered all the questions.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. And don't give up the hope, because I'm really thinking that we need to be very strong, but there are results of our work and your work as well. So I'm really hoping to see it soon, the change.
It was great to meet you.
Thank you so much.